The morning mist hung low over the bocage of Normandy, shrouding the rolling fields in a fragile, silvery veil. Oberfähnrich Klaus Meier peered through the periscope of his Panzer IV Ausf. Brushing a thin layer of condensation from the optics. The tank's engine hummed a steady, metallic rhythm beneath him, a sound that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. Around him, the 2nd Panzer Division prepared for the inevitable, a silent ballet of steel and discipline honed over years of conquest. Tracks crunched over the soft, damp earth, and the scent of oil and gunmetal filled the cramped interior of the fighting compartment. Meier's crew, a gunner, loader, radio operator, and driver moved with mechanical precision. Each man absorbed in his station, eyes alert, fingers steady, yet their minds lightly tinged with the same undercurrent of confidence that had carried German armoured forces across Europe for half a decade. In staff rooms miles behind the front, German intelligence officers had compiled reports on the latest Allied tanks. Word had reached Berlin of American Shermans equipped with the new 76mm gun firing HVAP, high-velocity armour-piercing rounds designed to punch through thick frontal armour. Meier, reading the translated reports days earlier, had allowed himself a faint smile. "Propaganda," he muttered to his driver, a wiry young man from Hamburg named Franz. "The Americans exaggerate as they always do. A 76mm Sherman against a Panzer IV or Panther? Impossible." His confidence was not misplaced, at least, according to every tactical manual, training exercise, and combat encounter he had ever known. The doctrine that had guided the Wehrmacht's armoured divisions since the early blitzkriegs was straightforward. Armour faced armour head-on, exploiting frontal protection, sloped glacis, and superior fire control to crush opposition. The Panzer IV, the workhorse of the Wehrmacht, with its 75mm KWK 40 litres, 48 gun, had proven itself time and again in France, the Balkans, and the Eastern Front. It could engage enemy tanks from hundreds of meters away and shrug off hits from smaller calibers. The Panther, with its thick, sloped frontal armor and long 75mm Quake 42 liters, 70, had earned a reputation as a tank killer, capable of destroying Allied armor before they could close to effective range. To Meier and his peers, the equation seemed simple. Frontal armor provided invulnerability, mobility allowed positioning, and German gunnery skills ensured kills before the enemy could react. Across Normandy, similar confidence permeated the ranks. Panzer officers reviewed maps and aerial reconnaissance photos, noting hedgerows, sunken lanes, and wooded copses where Allied forces might attempt to infiltrate. Their strategy relied on the assumption that if enemy tanks attempted a frontal engagement, German crews would dominate, and any weaknesses could be countered with flanking or artillery support. Meier's company commander had spent the better part of a week rehearsing these tactics, walking through scenarios with meticulous precision. German armoured doctrine had been tested in Poland, France, North Africa, and the Soviet Union, and its lessons were hard-coded into the minds of officers and enlisted alike. Yet, reports of the 76mm Shermans had begun circulating through intelligence channels like an unwelcome rumour. Allied radio intercepts and captured reconnaissance indicated a weapon that could, in theory, punch through Panzer IV frontal armour at ranges that German gunners had once considered safe. The information arrived at headquarters in coded transmissions, analysed and disseminated with caution. By mid-April, officers like Meier had heard the rumours filtered through layers of command. Shermans with HVAP could penetrate even the Panther's glacis under certain conditions, they said, but the report lacked specificity. Ranges, angles, and quantities remained uncertain. For German crews accustomed to technical superiority and the regularity of battlefield outcomes, the story sounded improbable. The Americans have a new toy. Meier's radio operator, Heinrich, commented one morning as he adjusted the tank's antenna. "Probably just propaganda. No tank can punch through frontal armour like ours." Meier nodded, though he had noticed the lingering uncertainty in Heinrich's voice. Across the front, similar whispers rippled among crews, whispers that questioned the invincibility of their tanks. Yet, these concerns were fleeting. drowned out by years of success and the institutional certainty that German tanks were simply superior in design, firepower, and crew training. Meier thought back to the endless exercises in crew coordination. The Panzer IV was not merely a collection of armor plates and guns. It was a machine optimized for human control. The gunner could engage targets with remarkable precision, the loader and commander operated in seamless rhythm, and the driver could place the tank into optimal firing positions, even over the most uneven terrain. Each Panzer IV represented a synergy of mechanical engineering and human skill, an orchestra of destruction practiced over thousands of miles of combat. Against this, the mere possibility of a Sherman capable of piercing their frontal armor seemed almost absurd. The days passed in quiet tension. The Normandy bocage, deceptively tranquil, masked the preparations of thousands of tanks, artillery, and infantrymen poised to face an invasion that everyone knew was coming. Meier's company conducted final drills, calibrating guns, checking ammunition, and rehearsing hedgerow ambushes. Crews joked lightly to keep nerves in check, sharing stories of past campaigns where the Panzer IV had demolished enemy tanks with impunity. Laughter echoed inside the cramped compartments, a mechanical camaraderie built on confidence, experience, and the deeply ingrained belief that German armor was untouchable from the front. It was a belief reinforced by technical manuals and propaganda alike. Training films depicted Shermans being torn apart by German 75mm fire. Reports from Italian campaigns and the Eastern Front celebrated the invincibility of sloped armor and the lethality of the panzer gun. Every detail, from ammunition ballistics to glacis angles, was meticulously drilled into crews, ensuring that when they faced Allied armor, their minds would instinctively rely on doctrine. The notion of invulnerability was not arrogance. It was the logical conclusion of their experience. Yet, as Meier peered again through his periscope, tracing the contours of distant hedgerows, there was a faint unease beneath the veneer of confidence. The rumors of HVAP, though dismissed, had planted a seed, a subtle, almost imperceptible acknowledgement that Allied innovation might challenge even the most rigorously tested doctrines. In the hours before the coming storm, as Normandy's fields lay quiet beneath early morning mist, Oberfähnrich Klaus Meier and his Panzer IV crew readied themselves for a battle that would test the limits of their faith in frontal armor. They did not know it yet, but the calm before D-Day would soon give way to the shock of a weapon that turned their assumptions upside down, a weapon that would render their most cherished doctrine nearly obsolete. The Germans were confident. They were prepared. They were certain of victory. And for the first time in years, they had reason to doubt. The morning sun rose pale and cold over the hedgerows of Normandy on April 12, 1944, casting long shadows across ploughed fields and narrow lanes. Oberfähnrich Klaus Meier and his Panzer IV crew were conducting a routine patrol along the northern edge of their sector, the rumble of their tracks muffled by the soft earth. It had been days since the intelligence whispers about the new American Shermans reached divisional headquarters, but within the armored ranks, those rumors were still dismissed. German tankers had faced Matildas, Churchills, and even earlier Shermans on the Italian and Western fronts they had survived. Nothing could punch the frontal armor of a Panzer IV or Panther, they believed. Meier's gunner, Lieutenant Fritz Keller, adjusted his sights and glanced through the optical scope at a distant tree line. "Nothing in sight," he reported. His voice carried a calm precision, the same precision drilled into him by months of gunnery practice at the Panzer School in Munster. Around him, the tank's hull rattled as the loader, Johann Weber, checked the alignment of the ammunition racks. The crew moved with the quiet confidence of men who had survived hundreds of engagements, whose machines had become extensions of their own bodies. It was then that the distant sound of engines reached them, different from the muted rumble of German tanks, high-pitched, urgent, and unmistakably American. Meier's radio operator, Heinrich, turned sharply to the intercom. "Unknown tanks, 2 o'clock, medium armor, fast-moving." The report, crisp and anxious, brought an immediate sense of alert. Meier's eyes narrowed. Medium armor? Likely Shermans. Standard 75mm? He hoped aloud, more to reassure himself than to question intelligence. The Shermans appeared over the crest of the ridge. At first, they looked unremarkable medium tanks, bulky but unspectacular, painted in drab olive drab with bright American stars. But as the formation closed, something in Meier's gut shifted. These were no ordinary M4s. The barrels of their 76mm guns, long and imposing, gleamed in the morning light. And more ominously, the glint of HVAP high-velocity armor-piercing rounds was just visible as they rotated in the breaches. "Firing range 1,200 meters," Meier commanded, feeling the familiar rush of anticipation. The Panzer IV's 75mm KVK 40 liters, 48 was designed for just this. Engaging enemy armor at medium distances, sloping glacis to deflect shots, and crewed by men trained to exploit every millimeter of protection. They had faced numerically superior forces before. They would face them again. Confidence, carefully cultivated over years of campaigns, surged through the tank. The first shot shattered the morning calm. Meier felt the slight recoil through the hull as his main gun fired. The round struck the lead Sherman just above the tracks, producing a dull metallic explosion and a spray of dirt. But the effect was not as expected. Instead of being disabled, the Sherman lurched forward, smoke curling from the impact site, but its gun remained aligned and operational. A cold realization struck the crew simultaneously. The HVAP round had penetrated their frontal armor. Was that just a scratch?" whispered Keller, eyes wide behind his goggles. Weber's hands froze on the shell levers. Heinrich swore under his breath, gripping the intercom as static images of post-mortem tests he had seen in staff briefings flitted through his mind. HVAP rounds were different tungsten cord, extremely high velocity, designed to punch cleanly through armor that would have been impervious to conventional 75mm rounds. The textbooks had warned about them. Now they were here. The next moments became a chaotic ballet of steel and fire. The lead Sherman returned fire, the HVAP round slamming into Meier's tank just above the driver's viewport. The impact sent a shudder through the hull, buckling the armor slightly and tearing away paint, leaving a jagged scar across the glacis. The sound, metallic and penetrating, reverberated through the tank. The crew froze, stunned by the unexpected violation of what they had believed invulnerable. "Frontal armor! Nothing!" Meier shouted, voice taut with disbelief. He adjusted his periscope frantically, scanning for the next threat. Shermans advanced in a staggered formation, each tank firing rounds that systematically tested the limits of German armor. Meier's Panzer IV was now the center of concentrated fire. HVAP shells struck in rapid succession, one across the turret ring, another along the lower glacis, and yet another ricocheted along the side skirt. Each strike produced violent impacts, dented steel, and sparks. But the tank held, teetering on the edge of mechanical failure, yet refusing to collapse entirely. Reports from adjacent Panzer IVs confirmed the same horrifying reality. Oberleutnant Heinrich Krüger, commanding a nearby platoon, radioed back. "Multiple HVAP impacts. Frontal plates compromised. We cannot stop them." Across the line, commanders were issuing similar panic-laced reports. German tankers had known technically superior tanks existed, but until now, they had never faced them in battle. The HVAP Shermans rendered all conventional assumptions about frontal armor obsolete in a matter of minutes. Meier's training kicked in despite the shock. He ordered a withdrawal into the hedgerows, attempting to use terrain for partial cover, angling the tank to present a less exposed profile. Yet every maneuver seemed futile. The HVAP rounds punched through angles as effectively as flat armor. Meier's gunner, Keller, struggled to find a target that wasn't actively firing back, the psychological strain evident in every tremor of his hands. Every shot fired felt like a desperate attempt to impose old doctrines on a battlefield where those doctrines no longer applied. The encounter lasted less than 15 minutes, but changed the course of Meier's perception of armored warfare. By the time the Shermans withdrew to regroup, the 2nd Panzer Division had suffered damage that would have been unthinkable hours earlier. Tanks were immobilized, turret ring mechanisms jammed, and crews were shaken to the core. Casualties were light, but morale had taken a heavy blow. Oberfähnrich Meier, who had previously considered himself invincible within the protective embrace of his Panzer IV, sat in silence as the realization set in. Frontal armor no longer guaranteed survival. After the skirmish, divisional intelligence compiled the first field reports of the 76mm HVAP-equipped Shermans. Crews admitted, in the coded, understated language of German military reports, that frontal armor did nothing against this new threat. Meier reviewed the summaries late that night, his hands trembling slightly as he traced the lines on the map where German positions had been compromised. The report read, Panzer IV frontal armor ineffective at ranges less than 1,500 meters. HVAP rounds penetrate glacis and turret front reliably. Panther frontal armor compromised at similar ranges. Morale impact severe. It was not merely a technical failure, it was a psychological shock. German armored doctrine, built on decades of experience, emphasized frontal engagement. Tanks had been designed to face enemy fire head-on, and crews had trained extensively for this mode of combat. Now, the foundational assumption of their entire operational philosophy had been shattered. Meier knew that future engagements would be defined not by tactical skill alone, but by how rapidly commanders could adapt to a weapon that rendered their armor vulnerable in ways they had never imagined. As night fell over the Normandy countryside, the Panzer IVs lay silently in camouflaged positions, engines off, crews exhausted but restless. Meier stared into the darkness beyond the periscope, aware that the battlefield had fundamentally changed. The HVAP Shermans were not just another tank, they were a revelation. They would force the Wehrmacht to rethink armored doctrine, to reconsider frontal engagement as a default strategy. For the first time in years, German tankers confronted the realization that technical superiority alone was not enough, and that even the most confident crews could be unprepared for the engineering ingenuity of their enemies. Oberfähnrich Klaus Meier would never forget the sound of those first HVAP rounds striking steel metal screaming under the impact, the reverberation echoing through the hull, and the quiet, dawning understanding. The era of invulnerable frontal armor had ended. By mid-April 1944, the reality of the 76mm HVAP Shermans had sunk into the German armored corps, and panic mingled with disbelief among the ranks. Oberfähnrich Klaus Meier and his Panzer IV crew were no longer patrolling isolated sectors. They were part of a defensive screen stretching across the bocage of Normandy, anticipating an Allied landing that intelligence suggested would arrive any day. Every day brought more encounters with Shermans armed with HVAP, and every encounter chipped away at the confidence that German tankers had built over years of campaigns in France, Italy, and the Eastern Front. Meier's division, the 2nd Panzer, was ordered to conduct aggressive reconnaissance to gauge the new threat. On April 16th, Meier led a platoon of 4 Panzer IVs along the Dives River, moving cautiously through narrow lanes bordered by high hedgerows. Visibility was limited, forcing crews to rely on binoculars, periscopes, and the intercom chatter of fellow tankers. Reports of a larger American armored presence had circulated, but no one anticipated the speed at which the HVAP Shermans could appear and dominate engagements. The first contact occurred near the village of Saint-Pierre-sur-Dives. Meier's forward observer spotted the American formation. 8M4 are 3 Shermans with 76mm guns, advancing with a fluidity German crews had rarely seen in Allied armor. The Shermans were arrayed in a staggered formation, maximizing fire arcs and minimizing exposure, a tactical nuance honed from years of North African and Italian campaign experience. Range 1,500 meters, Keller called out, adjusting his sight for the first shot. Meier's confidence, tempered by recent experiences, was cautious but present. He remembered the earlier skirmish and the first sting of HVAP rounds. Still, doctrine dictated action. Engage at maximum range, fire the main gun, and exploit armor angles. The 1st Panzer IV in the line opened fire, and the shells struck the lead Sherman's frontal glacis. For a moment, German crews allowed themselves a brief sense of hope. The Sherman shuddered, smoke curling from the impact site. But the effect was fleeting. HVAP rounds penetrated armor with a speed and precision that defied conventional calculations. The lead Sherman's turret rotated, firing back almost immediately. The round impacted Meier's tank above the hull driver's viewport, producing a violent shudder and splintering the frontal plate. Sparks and shards of metal sprayed inside the compartment. "Frontal armor, useless!" Meier shouted, his voice a mix of disbelief and rage. He felt the tremor of each subsequent hit reverberate through the hull. Sparks danced across his boots, the smell of scorched metal and burnt lubricants filling the air. The Shermans advanced with relentless efficiency, each shot testing armor thickness, each impact eroding confidence. In less than 10 minutes, 2 Panzer IVs were disabled, their crews scrambling to escape through the hatch. Meier's tank suffered minor mechanical damage but remained operational, a testament to the overbuilt engineering that German crews still relied upon. Even so, the psychological effect was devastating. Veterans whispered among themselves. If the Shermans could destroy Panzer IVs from ranges and angles previously thought safe, what chance did the heavier Panthers and Tigers have? German intelligence had underestimated American production and tactical innovation. Whereas the Panzer divisions relied on concentrated methodical deployment of heavy armor, the Americans leveraged mobility, firepower, and tactical flexibility. HVAP rounds, designed to pierce even Panther frontal armor at ranges up to 2,000 meters, rendered the standard German approach obsolete. Oberfähnrich Meier realized that the American strategy was not simply to engage, it was to unbalance and overwhelm, using superior technology and concentrated methodical fire. The 2nd Panzer Division regrouped behind the hedgerows. Officers gathered for impromptu assessments of the encounter. "The Americans are not using 75 mm, Oberleutnant Heinrich Kruger reported. "They have HVAP. Our frontal armor is insufficient. All units report penetration at standard engagement ranges. Tanks are being destroyed or immobilized before they can effectively respond." Each officer, trained to rely on the supposed invulnerability of the Panzer IV's frontal plates, struggled to process the reality. The new Shermans were rewriting the rules of armored combat. Reports reached the divisional command post. Major General Ernst von Salm, responsible for armored readiness in the sector, pored over the field reports and radio transcripts. His brow furrowed. "They cannot be stopped with frontal engagements," he muttered, scanning data from multiple engagements. Meier's report was succinct and grim. HVAP rounds penetrate Panzer IV frontal armor at 1,200 meters. Turret and glacis compromised. Casualties rising. Morale weakening. The effect on crew psychology was immediate and visible. Tankers, who had previously operated with mechanical precision, now hesitated. Even experienced gunners like Keller second-guessed the angles of fire, worried about being overexposed. Drivers moved cautiously, limiting speed to avoid exposing hulls, while loaders meticulously checked ammunition racks, aware that a misfire or mechanical jam could be fatal. The war, once defined by steel and speed, had become an exercise in survival against a weapon that invalidated decades of tactical doctrine. By April 20th, the cumulative effect of these engagements had created a new kind of attrition. While German tanks remained mechanically formidable, they were now vulnerable in ways no doctrine could fully anticipate. Field reports noted, Panzer IVs destroyed, 12. Panthers disabled, 3. Crew casualties, 18. Engagement duration per encounter. The Americans, in contrast, reported minimal losses, often using speed and cover to disengage after testing armor effectiveness. Meier and his crew, resting for the night in a hedgerow, discussed the implications in hushed tones. "We've relied on frontal armor for years," Keller said quietly. "Everything we trained for, all of it." His voice trailed off. Meier nodded grimly. "We cannot engage them the same way. Frontal shots, open fields, they are death. We must adapt or we will be ground into dust." Weber, staring at the tracks churned into the mud, added, "And the numbers? They just keep coming." more tanks, more guns, more ammo. Intelligence confirmed their fears. The American HVAP Shermans were being produced at unprecedented rates. Lockheed and Chrysler factories in the United States were supplying hundreds of these vehicles monthly, each with standardized HVAP loads. By May, divisions would face not isolated encounters but continuous streams of Sherman armor capable of penetrating Panzer IVs and Panthers alike, forcing German commanders to rethink deployments, avoid open engagements, and reconsider the very principles of armored warfare. The hedgerows themselves became lethal crucibles. German crews, trained for open-field tank battles, were forced to maneuver through narrow lanes, constrained by terrain that limited their guns and restricted their fields of fire. Meanwhile, HVAP Shermans exploited range, firepower, and superior coordination, striking repeatedly with impunity. Casualties mounted, and the realization crystallized. The era of German armored dominance in Normandy had ended. Frontal armor, once the cornerstone of doctrine, was now an invitation to destruction. Meier's final thought that night lingered with him as he drifted into a fitful sleep. The Germans had faced numerically inferior forces before, but they had never faced an opponent capable of mass-producing technology that could render their armored invulnerability meaningless. For the first time, tankers understood the frightening reality. The battlefield had shifted, and the old rules no longer applied. Survival depended not on armor, but on ingenuity, flexibility, and an acknowledgement that the war had entered a new Phase I dominated by American firepower and the lethal promise of HVAP. By late April 1944, the relentless encounters with 76mm HVAP Shermans had forced German armored commanders to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their doctrine, honed over 5 years of warfare, was failing. Oberfähnrich Klaus Meier and his Panzer IV crew had survived several engagements, but the once unshakable confidence in frontal armor had eroded. Across Normandy, Panzer divisions were forced to adapt, improvising tactics, under the relentless pressure of American firepower. Meier's unit received orders to consolidate defensive positions along the hedgerows west of Bayeux. These natural barriers, which had frustrated Allied infantry in earlier skirmishes, were now envisioned as survival mechanisms for tanks against HVAP rounds. German planners understood that standard frontal engagements in open fields were no longer viable. Heavy Shermans could penetrate Panzer IV glacis at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters, rendering classic armored formations suicidal. The Germans began experimenting with what crews called reverse slopes and hull-down positions. Tanks would be positioned behind hedgerows or embankments, exposing only the turret to potential fire. Meier's Panzer IV, nicknamed Stahlwolf, was camouflaged with local foliage, the long barrel of its 75mm Quake-40 carefully aligned to cover anticipated approach routes. Observers perched on rooftops and in trees acted as forward spotters, directing fire onto advancing Shermans before the Americans could utilize the terrain to their advantage. The first test of these adaptations came on April 23 near the village of La Chapelle. Intelligence had reported a mixed American armor column of 12 76mm Shermans, supported by light tanks and armored half-tracks. Meier's platoon, reinforced by a Panther company, set up along the western hedgerow, calculating fields of fire to create overlapping zones of fire. The Germans knew the HVAP rounds could pierce frontal armor, but angled hulls and cover could reduce effective penetration at first contact. As the Americans advanced, Meier felt the familiar tension in his gut. He peered through the periscope, noting the Sherman column moving in disciplined formation, every vehicle spaced to avoid easy mass fire kills. "Hold fire until 800 meters," he ordered, recalling lessons from previous skirmishes. His loader, Heinrich Weber, counted shells in a low, steady voice. 1, 2, 8 per gun, 425 rounds each, but careful now. The first exchange was lethal and instructive. Meier's tank fired from hull down, the round striking a Sherman in the turret side. The impact caused smoke but failed to immobilize the vehicle. HVAP rounds were designed for maximum penetration and efficiency, but here the sloped angle of the turret reduced their effectiveness. A second round struck a Sherman's hull flank, detonating the ammunition in the enemy's port side compartment. The explosion disabled the lead vehicle, but the Shermans pressed forward, relying on numbers and coordinated fire to suppress German positions. Field reports from that engagement underscored the emerging reality. The Germans could no longer rely on armor alone. They needed coordinated positioning, terrain advantage, and concentrated fire to have any chance of survival. Over the next several days, divisions experimented with staggered lines, where Panzer IVs, Panthers, and anti-tank guns were interspersed to maximize crossfire and minimize the risk of individual losses. Communication became paramount, as crews relayed visual and radio information to adjust firing angles against highly mobile HVAP Shermans. Meier noted another lesson. Distance was now critical. The Germans had relied on engagement ranges of 1,500–2,000 meters in prior campaigns, but HVAP allowed American gunners to effectively penetrate armor well beyond those distances. Tactical doctrine shifted toward avoidance of frontal engagements wherever possible. Instead, the Germans sought to force Shermans into ambushes, using terrain bottlenecks, forests, and villages to mitigate the American speed and firepower advantage. Despite these adaptations, the psychological impact of HVAP persisted. Meier's platoon discussed the new reality during briefings and evening meals in the hedgerows. Veteran crews, many of whom had survived campaigns across the Eastern Front, expressed unease. "We have to rethink everything," said Lieutenant Karl Schneider, a Panther commander. "We can't match them in frontal duels. Our armor is useless if we do. We need ambush, surprise, and terrain. And even then..." His voice trailed off as the distant thunder of artillery and Sherman engines echoed across the countryside. Reports from other divisions confirmed similar patterns. Engagements in the Bocage region, near Carentan and Saint-Lô, showed that German armor could survive only when using tactical ingenuity. Direct confrontations led to catastrophic losses. Ambushes or hull-down positions sometimes allowed tanks to disable Shermans before being forced to retreat. Casualty ratios, once assumed to favor German armor, now leaned toward the Americans. Panzer IVs were being destroyed or immobilized in numbers that traditional doctrine could not explain. The Germans also faced logistical pressures. Spare parts for tanks and anti-tank guns were limited, fuel shortages were growing acute, and experienced crews were increasingly casualties of HVAP's effectiveness. Each destroyed Panzer IV or Panther represented not only a material loss but the depletion of crew experience accumulated over years. In post-action reports, Oberleutnant Kruger wrote, "We have learned that armor is no longer a guarantee of survival. The Americans have combined mobility, firepower, and production in a way that we cannot match. Every engagement is costly. Every tank lost a strategic blow." By early May, the Germans attempted more complex defensive maneuvers. Convoys were staggered, tanks covered one another from different angles, and infantry and self-propelled anti-tank guns provided additional layers of protection. Despite these innovations, HVAP Shermans continued to dominate in open fields, and even clever positioning could not fully negate the Americans' advantage. Meier's crew began to rely on conservative engagement policies. Avoid combat when possible, allow Shermans to pass, unless absolutely necessary, and use terrain to channel attackers into kill zones. The lessons learned were brutal but transformative. German tankers realized that superior frontal armor, once their defining advantage, had been rendered obsolete. The battlefield had shifted. Survival required adaptation, cunning, and constant vigilance. Meier reflected on these lessons during a rare quiet moment in the hedgerow, gazing across fields scarred by artillery and tank tracks. The Sherman, previously dismissed as a lesser machine, had become the arbiter of armored dominance. Casualty reports illustrated the scale of adaptation challenges. Between April 15th and May 5th, German Panzer IV losses numbered 47, with 12 Panthers disabled and 21 crews killed or wounded. American reports indicated 8 Shermans lost, a fraction of the damage inflicted, emphasizing not only firepower but the effectiveness of HVAP combined with superior tactics and numbers. These statistics, collected from the 2nd. Panzer's engagements were shared with divisional command, a sober accounting of attrition that demanded doctrinal revision. By the time Meier's platoon withdrew to reorganize behind the Orne River, the reality was clear. The 76mm HVAP Sherman was not merely a technical improvement, it represented a strategic paradigm shift. The combination of armor penetration, rapid production, and tactical flexibility had rendered German frontal engagement doctrine increasingly irrelevant. Crews who had once relied on steel and confidence now relied on ingenuity, terrain, and the slim hope that ambushes could offset the technological advantage they faced. Meier's final observation in his field journal encapsulated the transformation. "We have faced weapons that defy our assumptions, tactics that make our training insufficient, and a doctrine that is no longer viable. The Sherman with HVAP is not just a tank, it is a herald of a new way of war. Frontal armor is no longer protection, it is invitation." In the hedgerows of Normandy, the first whispers of shock had turned into a resounding realization. The battlefield had changed forever. The Panzer's era of dominance was ending, and the HVAP Sherman had become the instrument of tactical upheaval that would define the next phase of armored warfare in Western Europe. By late July 1944, the attrition in Normandy had left German panzer divisions stretched to the breaking point. Oberfähnrich Klaus Meier's unit, once confident in the impenetrability of their armor, now faced an unrelenting cascade of American 76mm Shermans equipped with HVAP rounds. The hedgerows that had once been a defensive boon now resembled graveyards of steel as the Allies prepared for Operation Cobra, the long-planned breakout from the bocage that would decide the fate of German armored forces in Normandy. Meier and his platoon received orders to hold defensive positions along the southern approaches to Saint-Lô. These positions were chosen for their natural defensive advantage: rolling fields, sunken lanes, and hedgerows that could channel advancing armor into kill zones. Yet the planners knew that even the most advantageous terrain offered only temporary reprieve. Intelligence reports indicated that American forces would mass armored columns, exceeding 200 vehicles, supported by heavy artillery and tactical airstrikes. The presence of HVAP Shermans meant that any frontal engagement, even from hull-down positions, carried extraordinary risk. In the command post near the village of Le Mesnil, Oberst Hans von Richter briefed his officers. "The Americans are using HVAP Shermans to pierce everything in front of them," he said, spreading a map across the table. "Your Panzer IVs, even Panthers, cannot engage head-on without catastrophic losses. We must rely on ambush, terrain, and overlapping fire. You will not fight as individuals, you will fight as a network. Every tank, every gun, every squad must cover the other." Meier's crew prepared Stahlwolf with painstaking care. Foliage was secured to the turret, mud smeared along the hull for additional camouflage, and the gun's calibration checked against known ranges of HVAP fire. Meier reviewed previous engagements, noting the patterns of American attack. The Shermans preferred to engage in column formation, using numbers and range to their advantage. The Germans had learned that patience and concealment were essential. Firing prematurely would reveal positions and invite annihilation. The breakthrough began on July 25th. A combined force of 2nd and 3rd American Armored Divisions surged toward Saint-Lô, their advance shielded by tactical air support. From Meier's vantage point in a sunken lane, the first waves of Shermans appeared at 1,200 meters, glinting in the summer sun. The Germans held fire. Even at this distance, Meier knew that HVAP rounds could penetrate their frontal armor with lethal precision. He ordered the crew to wait until the lead tanks were within 800 meters, maximizing the probability of disabling them before American gunners could react. When the order came, the German defensive line erupted. Meier's Panzer IV fired, the round striking a Sherman turret side and immobilizing it. Across the hedgerows, other Panzer IVs and Panthers executed the same coordinated strikes. The effect was initially devastating. American Shermans were knocked out before reaching full assault speed. Yet the Americans adapted quickly. Following established doctrine, The Sherman columns dispersed, using terrain and cover to reduce losses. Their gunners, trained in coordinated fire and supported by infantry spotting teams, returned effective fire. Meier's crew observed firsthand the brutal efficiency of HVAP Shermans. One Sherman, hit multiple times in the frontal glacis, continued advancing. The KV-3 style rounds of the Panzer IV caused minor damage, but HVAP penetrated the side of the turret, killing the commander and wounding the loader. Another Sherman was struck in the lower hull. Instead of being destroyed outright, the round detonated the ammunition inside, transforming the tank into an immobile inferno. The combination of accuracy, rate of fire, and penetrating power overwhelmed even well-prepared defensive positions. The German officers began adjusting their tactics in real time. Lieutenant Karl Schneider directed Panther units to engage from reverse slopes, forcing Shermans into crossfire lanes. Artillery observers coordinated strikes with anti-tank crews, targeting tanks as they slowed to negotiate hedgerows and canal crossings. Yet even with these measures, casualty rates remained severe. By the end of the first day, German reports noted 42 Panzer IVs and 15 Panthers destroyed or disabled, with over 120 crewmen killed or wounded. American losses, though significant, were comparatively lighter. 18 Shermans destroyed and 27 disabled, most recoverable after repair. The operational lesson was clear. HVAP Shermans had reshaped the battlefield. German commanders, previously reliant on the protective advantage of thick frontal armor, were forced into constant maneuvering and improvisation. In post-action reports, Oberst von Richter admitted that frontal engagements were nearly suicidal. "We have faced weapons that our armor cannot resist," he wrote. "Even our best crews, in the most advantageous positions, suffer catastrophic losses. We are forced into defensive improvisation, and yet the Americans continue to press with overwhelming effectiveness." Meier's crew endured several engagements over the next 3 days. Each encounter reinforced the same truths. The HVAP Shermans could penetrate Panther and Panzer IV armor with devastating reliability. Frontal assaults were deadly, and tactical adaptation ambush, hull-down positions, reverse slopes was no guarantee of survival. Yet the Germans learned to exploit small advantages, such as terrain-induced choke points and concentrated overlapping fire. These adaptations, while mitigating some losses, could not stop the inevitable advance. By July 28, Operation Cobra achieved a decisive breakthrough. American armored columns poured through the weakened German lines, exploiting gaps created by attrition, delayed reinforcements, and shattered morale. Meier's platoon, one of the few still combat-capable units in the sector, attempted a fighting withdrawal toward Mortain. Each engagement along the retreating route highlighted the stark contrast in armored doctrine. American crews leveraged firepower, speed, and numbers, while German crews relied on ingenuity and experience, often at a fatal cost. The psychological effect on German tankers was profound. Veteran crews, who had fought through Poland, France, and Russia, described the HVAP Sherman as invincible from the front and unrelenting in attack. Meier recorded in his journal, "We have survived by cunning and luck, but the tanks that used to intimidate us now fall before these American machines. Armor, once our shield, is no longer protection. We face a force designed not just to fight, but to annihilate." By the time Meier's unit reached Mortain, the breakout had fractured German defensive cohesion. Operational integrity was lost, command structures disrupted, and armored reserves depleted. Casualty statistics were staggering. Panzer divisions in the sector lost over 200 tanks in a week, with crews suffering high attrition rates. American forces, with comparatively light losses, capitalized on these advantages, advancing steadily toward Avranches and opening the path for the liberation of Brittany. The operational record of HVAP Shermans in Operation Cobra became a case study in armored warfare. German reports, collected after the campaign, noted that frontal armor, long the cornerstone of Panzer doctrine, was effectively nullified. Even Panthers, with their advanced sloped armor, were vulnerable to high-velocity rounds at combat ranges exceeding 1,500 meters. German assessments concluded that survival now depended on a combination of terrain exploitation, ambush tactics, and sheer luck, rather than the mechanical superiority of armor. For Meier and his crew, the week marked a turning point. Survival was no longer a matter of technical skill or doctrine alone. It required constant adaptation to a new reality defined by American firepower and tactical acumen. The HVAP Sherman had proven itself not merely as an upgraded vehicle, but as a transformational weapon that reshaped armored engagements across Normandy. As the sun set over the shattered fields near Mortain, Meier looked back at the hedgerows and villages left behind, counting the tanks that had not returned. The landscape bore witness to the new truth. Frontal armor had failed, veteran crews had been lost, and a technological and tactical revolution in armored warfare was complete. The war in Normandy had been won not just by courage, but by firepower, mobility, and innovation. The HVAP Sherman had rewritten the rules, and no German tanker could deny it. By early August 1944, the consequences of Operation Cobra were unmistakable. German panzer divisions, once the spearhead of armoured dominance in Europe, were in full retreat across Normandy and into Brittany. Oberfähnrich Klaus Meier's unit, reduced to a handful of operational Panzer IVs and Panthers, had become a microcosm of the Wehrmacht's armoured collapse. Reports from higher command were grim. The 2nd Panzer Division had lost over 60% of its tanks in a single week, with frontal armour proving ineffective against the 76mm Shermans HVAP rounds. Units that had relied on traditional German doctrine hold the line, engage frontal assaults, and exploit armour superiority now found those strategies fatal. Even well-concealed hull-down positions offered only temporary protection. One German after-action report noted, "The frontal glacis that once deflected shells now offers nothing. The Americans fire with precision, velocity, and unrelenting consistency." Meier's crew moved from one defensive position to the next, engaging sporadically in ambushes along hedgerows and forested lanes. These encounters were costly, each one a reminder of how HVAP ammunition had transformed the battlefield. A single well-placed round could penetrate the frontal armor of a Panther, ignite ammunition stores, and render the vehicle a burning wreck. Side shots were even deadlier, but frontal penetrations now eliminated the supposed advantage of heavy German armor. American tactical adaptation compounded German losses. Combined arms operations, integrating infantry, artillery, and tactical air support, ensured that Shermans rarely faced isolated German tanks. Air observers called in coordinates for artillery, while Sherman columns maneuvered to exploit gaps in hedgerows and overrun defensive strongpoints. Even veteran crews, trained on the Eastern Front and in France, were overwhelmed by the relentless pace and firepower. By mid-August, Meier's unit reached the vicinity of Avranches, the so-called gateway to Brittany. The advance of the Allies had become nearly unstoppable. German command attempted to form rear-guard actions, but scattered units, low on fuel, ammunition, and replacements, could offer only fleeting resistance. Meier's journal entry captures the despair. "Our tanks fall before the Americans as if they were paper. Frontal armor is useless. Every engagement is a gamble we are losing. Survival depends on terrain and luck, not skill or machine." The operational lesson was stark and universal across all panzer formations. The HVAP Sherman had nullified the historical advantage of German armor in frontal engagements. Reports filed after the Normandy campaign confirmed that survival rates for Panzer IVs and Panthers engaging 76mm HVAP Shermans head-on were catastrophically low. The Germans admitted openly in debriefings that no amount of armor or crew experience could counter the combination of high-velocity firepower, tactical coordination, and American numerical superiority. By the end of August 1944, the German armoured presence in Normandy had been effectively shattered. Survivors like Meier withdrew eastward, carrying the bitter knowledge that the war in France had been lost not through lack of courage or skill, but through the inexorable effectiveness of Allied armoured innovation. The HVAP Sherman had rewritten the rules of armored warfare. Frontal armor was no longer protection, and any German tanker facing it knew the odds were fatal. By September 1944, after the retreat from Normandy and the failed counterattacks in Brittany, German armored command faced an uncomfortable truth. Reports from surviving panzer crews and intelligence assessments converged on a single, undeniable conclusion. The frontal armor of even the heaviest tanks, the Panther and Tiger, was no longer sufficient against the new 76mm Sherman, armed with HVAP rounds. Oberfähnrich Klaus Meier, now assigned to rearguard reconnaissance, recorded in his journal the shift in mindset among his peers. "We trained to face Spitfires in the air, to fear no Sherman in the field," he wrote, "and yet the 76mm has made our armor obsolete. The glacis, the angled hull, the reinforced mantlet, these are words on paper. On the battlefield, they mean nothing." Memoirs from other panzer crews confirmed the same. Even hull-down positions, once a guarantee of survivability, offered little protection against HVAP. A single round striking the upper glacis could ignite ammunition, destroy the engine, and leave the crew with no chance of survival. Intelligence officers compiled detailed post-action reports documenting the American tank's performance. A standard engagement scenario noted in the 13 Panzer Corps debriefing for August 1944 emphasized the lethality of the HVAP-equipped Shermans. Panther frontal armor penetrated at ranges up to 1,200 meters, Panzer IV's even more vulnerable. The reports emphasized tactical implications. Frontal assaults against Shermans were now suicidal, forcing German tankers to attempt flanking maneuvers under fire, an increasingly rare opportunity given American combined arms tactics. In post-war interrogations, German officers admitted the psychological impact was as significant as the material. Veteran commanders reported that crews exhibited a new caution bordering on fatalism. As Meier recalled decades later at a 1,985 veterans reunion in Hamburg, "We did not laugh at the Shermans. We feared them. Every time one appeared on the ridge, our hearts sank. Armor meant nothing. Experience meant little. Only luck remained." The contrast between technical superiority and battlefield effectiveness became painfully clear. German tanks, theoretically superior in armor thickness, firepower, and optics, were neutralized by the Americans' combination of innovation, mass production, and tactical coordination. The 76mm HVAP round, a seemingly incremental improvement, had rendered obsolete the entire philosophy of frontal armored engagements that had guided Panzer doctrine since 1941. By the fall of 1944, German assessments shifted from disbelief to acceptance. Operational reports no longer argued about statistics or isolated victories. The consensus was unanimous. Against HVAP Shermans, frontal armor was not protection, it was a death sentence. Lessons were written, briefings conducted, and survivors like Meier became witnesses to a stark truth. American armored innovation, combined with overwhelming production and tactical integration, had rewritten the rules of armored warfare in Europe. By October 1944, the consequences of the HVAP-armed Sherman were fully manifest across the Western Front. German panzer units, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, now faced a stark reality. No amount of tactical ingenuity could fully compensate for the vulnerability of their armored vehicles against the Americans' improved firepower. Reports from the 13 Panzer Corps and individual division war diaries conveyed the same theme. Frontal armor, long considered a decisive advantage, had become largely symbolic in combat. Oberfähnrich Klaus Meier, reassigned to a command role in the 2nd Panzer Division after Normandy, witnessed the changes firsthand. "We had trained for precision, for tactical discipline, for the art of maneuver," he later recounted in a 1985 interview. All of it counted for nothing when the first HVAP round struck a Panther from over a kilometer away and tore it apart. Survivors described engagements in late September where entire panzer platoons, positioned in carefully chosen defensive positions, were destroyed before even firing their main guns. A Tiger I, often considered invulnerable from the front, could be disabled by a single well-placed 76mm HVAP shot to the upper glacis or turret ring. The effect on morale was devastating. Post-action reports from German panzer units illustrated the operational consequences. Flanking maneuvers, once a staple of armored tactics, were now attempted only under cover of darkness or dense terrain. The Wehrmacht's ability to conduct counterattacks collapsed, particularly in Normandy and Brittany. Where previously a Panther battalion could halt or even repel an American armored advance with careful positioning, the HVAP Shermans transformed those encounters into one-sided engagements. Commanders were forced to emphasize defensive retreats, delaying actions, and reliance on artillery support, an admission that tanks could no longer dominate the battlefield through armor and firepower alone. The psychological effect extended beyond tank crews. Panzer grenadiers operating alongside their armored units reported a profound change in battlefield confidence. Memoirs from the 116th Panzer Division describe the chilling impact of seeing Shermans advance under cover of artillery fire. Even heavily fortified positions were vulnerable. Meier recounted one particular engagement near Saint-Lô, where a line of Panthers, positioned to intercept advancing American armor, was reduced to burning hulks in under 15 minutes. The men knew they were doomed before the first shot, he wrote. Frontal armor had been our shield, now it was our coffin lid. German intelligence and post-war interrogations highlighted another significant dimension. The 76mm HVAP Shermans forced a reconsideration of tank production priorities. By late 1944, German engineers were acutely aware that the balance of armored power had shifted. Production of heavier tanks, like the Tiger II, was accelerated, but the results were insufficient. The complex machinery required months to build, often with substandard materials due to Allied bombing campaigns. Meanwhile, American factories were producing hundreds of Shermans each month, each capable of defeating the German vehicles previously deemed invincible. The ratio of quantity to quality now favored the Allies decisively. Tactical manuals and operational directives circulated among panzer units by November 1944 reflected the grim reassessment. Crews were ordered to avoid frontal engagements whenever possible, concentrate on ambush tactics, exploit terrain, and rely on combined arms coordination with infantry, artillery, and Luftwaffe support. Even so, reports indicated that these measures were stopgaps at best. By then, Allied forces had mastered integrated combined arms doctrine, pairing HVAP Shermans with artillery, air support, and infantry to create overwhelming combat power. The result was catastrophic for German armored formations, which increasingly suffered high attrition rates in every engagement. The strategic implications extended beyond the battlefield. Operational planners in the Wehrmacht recognized that the HVAP, Sherman, combined with American numerical superiority, had permanently altered the calculus of armored warfare. Large-scale counteroffensives, like the planned Ardennes operation, had to account for the new reality. Even heavy German tanks were vulnerable, and massed frontal assaults would result in devastating losses. Meier, reflecting on the Ardennes campaign decades later, noted, "We faced an enemy that could outproduce, outshoot, and outlast us. No Panther, no Tiger, no tactical genius could change that. Frontal armor was irrelevant against their numbers and firepower." Post-war analysis corroborated these first-hand accounts. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, combined with captured Japanese and German documents, confirmed the profound effectiveness of HVAP ammunition. In direct comparison, standard Sherman 75mm rounds had limited effect against Panther and Tiger frontal armor, but the 76mm HVAP variant could penetrate nearly every German medium and heavy tank from engagement distances typical in Western Europe. Detailed reports noted that Panther tanks, which had been considered nearly impervious from the front at ranges over 1,000 meters, could now be destroyed reliably at 801,200 meters, a distance at which German crews believed they were safe. Even German armored aces, long accustomed to battlefield improvisation, admitted defeat. In a 1946 debrief, one former Panzer Division commander noted, "We were masters of frontal engagements, taught to exploit armor and firepower. Yet against the HVAP Shermans, Our doctrine was obsolete. The frontal glacis offered no protection. Our tanks became nothing more than targets. The consensus was clear. Technology, combined with mass production and tactical evolution, had overturned decades of armored warfare theory. The aftermath of this revelation had enduring lessons. The German Panzer doctrine, built around the assumption that armor could decisively dominate the battlefield, was shown to have fundamental limitations when faced with superior anti-armor technology and industrial capacity.